The most common thing you'll see about geopolitics is analysts predicting the end of the Russian state and the breakup of its territory. But the truth is that this has been repeating every 10 years, at least for the last 100 years. However, despite the most varied crises of all kinds, Russia remains standing, being a powerful actor with the ability to balance or destabilize the world order depending on the moves it makes. In today's video, we're going to talk about Russia's geopolitics. But before that, don't forget to support the only geopolitics channel in Portuguese that exists, which is the Geopolitical Mundial channel, by subscribing and sharing the video with everyone you know. My name is Geopolitical Mundial and this is Geopolitical Mundial. Russia is the largest country in the world, with its geopolitical core consolidated around the Volga River and its current capital, Moscow, stretching from the north where St. Petersburg is today, giving access to the Baltic Sea, to the south in the area where the cities of Volgograd and Nizhny Novgorod are located, to the east, thus having access to the Caspian Sea. In other words, just its geopolitical core, the so-called Muscovite core by itself, is already larger than most countries. The region is large, but practically in general flat, without major geographical formations that could serve as natural defenses. For this reason, the history of Russia has basically been about surviving invasion after invasion by foreign forces, and due to this lack of natural defenses in its core, Moscow's strategy has been to drag wars out long enough to bleed and wear down its invaders. This factor of constant invasions, lack of natural defense, combined with long and bloody wars, has had a huge effect on its culture and psychology, and of course also on its politics, both internal and external. This becomes clear in its ancient history, with this Eurasian plain between the Baltic and the Black Sea being the approximate area where the Eastern Slavs would establish their first state. They stayed here because of the natural resources, the space for expansion, the relatively easy travel along river routes, and good locations to found cities and towns. However, since this region does not offer security, it has always been an open invitation for potential invaders, both from the east and the west, who wanted to take this fertile land for themselves. And once they did, those invaders had to remain strong and vigilant to defend their lands against the next invaders, who would surely come. The first identifiable group of people who controlled the steppes were the Cimmerians around 1000 before Christ, until they were conquered by a nomadic people called the Scythians around 700 before Christ, until 200 before Christ, when they were conquered by the Sarmatians, who would hold this region until 370, when they would finally be devastated by the Huns. The devastation caused by the Huns was so great that the region would not have any unified and relevant force until the 7th century, when the Avars took control of the steppe north of the Black Sea, who would in turn be subdued by the Khazars. In other words, for 2000 years, the region was nothing more than a crossroads where conquerors of the past were conquered by conquerors of the future. This would finally change when a prince of Kiev in 966 would defeat the Khazars, forming the prototype of the Russian state that would emerge in the future, where today is the area of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. The origin of the first Russian state, known as Kievan Rus, is uncertain and has been the subject of historical debate for a long time. The problem, at least for the Russians, is that the founders of this state were probably foreigners, warrior merchants from Scandinavia known as Varangians, and the term Russian probably refers to these people. But it is also possible that it refers to some Eastern Slavs who had already been living in the region for several centuries before. But if on one hand Kievan Rus would be the foundation of the future Russia, what would actually pave the way for its true birth would, ironically, be the invading force of the Mongols. These were nomadic tribes living on the northern plains of China, and they were mounted warriors and excellent horsemen. The Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus took place in 1237 with an attack against the eastern principality of Ryazan, and by 1240 the Mongols would attack the city of Kiev, the capital of Kievan Rus. They completely destroyed it, with most of the inhabitants being killed or taken as slaves. The destruction of Kiev was a devastating blow to Russian society, as the city was an important cultural and religious center as well as the seat of the Russian principalities. Its destruction marked the beginning of Mongol rule in the region, which would force Russian society to adapt to Mongol government and culture, leading to the future Russian culture becoming a blend of Mongol and Russian culture from that period. In the 15th century, the Principality of Moscow, under Ivan III's leadership, grew stronger and rebelled against Mongol rule. And in 1480, Ivan III managed to defeat the Mongols in a decisive battle and proclaimed himself the first Tsar of Russia, marking the beginning of the end of Mongol rule. Thanks to the collapse of Kievan Rus, the city of Moscow began to grow and stand out due to its strategic position around the Moskva River, a tributary of the Oka River, which in turn flows into the Volga River. This attracted important trade routes, which in turn helped its economic growth. However, the problem of the lack of natural barriers remained, and not by chance, the trauma of further invasions was now deeply rooted in the Russian mentality. Thus, to solve this problem, Russian strategists and statesmen have traditionally maintained the strategy started by Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century, which consisted of keeping control over distant geographical barriers that could serve as defense for their geopolitical core. This included central control over the Ural Mountains to ensure the eastern defense of the then Tsardom of Russia, while also guaranteeing dominance in the north toward the Arctic, especially by establishing control over the important Kola Peninsula. In the south, they consolidated control over the Caucasus Mountains, using this region as a barrier against potential Persian or Ottoman threats. In the 17th century, while the oceans were being contested by the marginal European empires such as Portugal, Spain, France, or England, Russia began a process of territorial expansion by land similar to the colonization process of Western European powers. They expanded eastward into the vast, flat, and practically empty region of Siberia, eventually reaching the Shenzhen Mountains, the Altai Mountains, and Lake Baikal in the east and southeast. By the middle of this century, the Russians would reach the Amur River and the outskirts of the Chinese Empire, then ruled by the Qin dynasty. After a period of conflict with this dynasty, Russia made peace with them in 1689, in which Russia gave up its territorial claims over the Amur Valley, but in turn gained access to the eastern region of Lake Baikal and the trade route to Beijing. An agreement that would open the way for the final advance toward the Pacific Ocean. In parallel to this race to the east, Russian Tsarism also continued its territorial growth in the southwest, claiming the so-called wild fields, where present-day eastern Ukraine and southwest Russia are located, which were under Polish-Lithuanian control. The Russian goal was to conquer both Crimea to gain maritime access to the Mediterranean Sea and the western part of Ukraine in order to use the Carpathian Mountains in the southwest as a defense against European forces. However, the plan failed, and Moscow's control over the region would only be established at the end of the 18th century. In 1721, the Tsardom of Russia then changed its name to the Russian Empire, when Tsar Pyotr I the Great decided to give the country a title more fitting to its growing importance on the international stage. He wanted the country to be seen as an empire, similar to the great powers of Europe, such as France and Great Britain, and used this new title to reflect that ambition. That ambition was not incompatible with the size of the nation, which now, in addition to dominating the western part of present-day Ukraine and Crimea, extended to the north of present-day Belarus, closing off access to the northern European plains. A flat and wide corridor that has been seen by Russian and European strategists as an area of full and continuous access to the geopolitical core of Russia. At that time as well, the Russians attempted their first overseas adventure, establishing colonies in the Americas, where Alaska and California are today. However, with the territory being excessively long and without sufficient naval capacity, these colonies ended up failing, and eventually Alaska would be sold to the United States in 1867. However, despite the Russian obsession with defensive regions far from their geopolitical core, this structure created two major gaps that have threatened the very core of Russia itself. The first, to the west, through the already mentioned North European plain, where Russia was never able to maintain direct control, having to resort to alliances or subjugation of local elites in order to maintain some form of influence over this territory. These North European plains begin in Poland and have traditionally served as an access bridge for foreign forces to directly strike at the Russian heartland without major difficulties, since this territory lacks significant natural barriers during the spring, summer, and most of the autumn. The famous invasions by Napoleon Bonaparte, the German Empire in the First World War, and the Nazi forces in the Second World War all used these plains as a corridor against Russia. Therefore, the positioning of the nations located on the North European plain has the ability to drastically change the geopolitical equation of the region. If the countries here fall under the influence of a state that rivals Russia, then Moscow is put in a defensive position. But on the other hand, if these nations come under the direct or indirect control of Moscow, then it is Russia that is able to put the countries of Western Europe in a defensive position. And the second, through the Kazakh plateaus in the south, which were referred to by the Polish-born United States-based geopolitical analyst Brzezinski as Russia's soft underbelly. In other words, it's a main area of vulnerability for the Russian state because it's located in its central and eastern part, where there is an ethnic and cultural diversity that is very different from the characteristics of the Moscow region, while at the same time being a very sparsely populated area without major geographical obstacles. However, this Russian geopolitical characteristic gained a strategic addition from the middle of the Cold War, which is the Arctic issue to the north. Due to its enormous energy and mineral potential, since the region holds at least 1/5 of the world's unexplored oil and natural gas reserves, it also has a vast reserve of critical metals and rare earth elements, which are fundamental resources for technological development in the 21st century. Even during the Cold War, Russia had already decided to build a series of military bases and scientific facilities to monitor the region and ensure its security at the beginning of the 21st century. Russia then began to invest in infrastructure projects to make the most of the riches of the Arctic region. This included the construction of ports, airports, and roads to facilitate access to the region. In addition, the Russians have sought to strengthen their military presence in the Arctic region by building military bases and developing new equipment for specific operations in that area. This includes the development of nuclear submarines and warships capable of operating in extreme weather conditions. Militarily, the success of their establishment over the Arctic could also consolidate Moscow's strategic capability over North America, allowing them to project their naval and ballistic capabilities over their main rival, the United States. Another key geostrategic point of the Soviets, which was inherited by Russia, lies in their geopolitical goal, that is, geopolitics in outer space. The United States and the Soviet Union competed for image and technology during the Cold War. The Soviet space program soon began to see space as a way for Moscow to bypass the choke points that could suffocate its armed forces on land. Today, this idea is maintained by Moscow, which in partnership with other countries, especially China, has maintained a robust and efficient program of space expansion, aiming even at the colonization of the moon and perhaps, in a more distant future, of the solar system. In addition, the Russian space issue being so developed fuels the terror of its rivals, who fear that in the future Moscow may come to militarize outer space. The Russian geostrategic perception must then, even today, be understood based on the strategy of Tsar Pyotr the Great, where the idea was for Russia to advance in all possible directions. Thus, the equation was simple. For the Russian state to survive attempts at foreign invasions, Russia should have control over buffer zones, thus being able to create friction that would wear down potential enemies. This issue of passage points and vulnerability becomes more obvious from a broad perspective, highlighting each one of them. Starting then from the Carpathian Mountains, Black Sea, Caucasus Mountains, Caspian Sea, Aral Sea, Tian Shan Mountains, Altai Mountains, Lake Baikal and Amur River, serving as geostrategic blockers, while the North European Plain, the Bessarabian Passage north of the Balkans, the Kazakh Corridor, and the Mongol Corridor are the flat access routes to Russian territories. In this sense, the Aral Sea stands out because what was once a blocker in the past is now part of the access route of the Kazakh Corridor. This sea, which is considered one of the worst environmental disasters in history, was not only a blocker, but also a prosperous fishing source for the Soviet Union. However, the combination of natural climatic factors, along with uncontrolled use of canals to supply cotton production, ended up drying out most of the Aral Sea, which today, instead of being a blocker, has become part of the access route. But this came at a heavy cost, because while geopolitically its size guaranteed the survival of the Russian state, on the other hand, the almost artificial establishment of cities in its eastern part had a huge human cost, causing enormous political strain for Moscow to maintain firm control over these regions. After all, the colonization of the East itself was carried out through forced migration, which was further intensified by the Soviet system during the Stalinist period. As a consequence, there was a huge loss of human life, mainly due to hunger, since the settlers in general, despite being forced to move to the interior of the Soviet Union, did not receive enough support from the Soviet state. And in many cases, immigration was even a punishment or a way to weaken regionalist sentiments that could eventually develop into separatist movements in the future. Supplying its eastern population has always been difficult for Moscow. After all, even though it's curious, on one hand Russia has vast amounts of arable and highly productive land. In addition to a good industrial capacity to produce food and supply not only its own population, but also part of the world's population. On the other hand, its vast size and lack of navigable rivers has always been a huge logistical problem. So, the traditional Russian problem has not been generating food capacity, but rather getting that production to the global market, since its interior lacks navigable rivers and the few that are navigable are frozen for much of the year. Another issue with this strategy was the fact that establishing a vast empire full of regions that could serve as a shield against potential invading forces also, at the same time, increased the number of interactions and geopolitical frictions with foreign powers. In other words, Russia eventually put itself in a position of permanent confrontation with almost every significant geopolitical force in Eurasia. With France, Germany and England to the west, Turkey and Iran to the south, China and Japan to the east, Canada to the north, and even at its most extreme eastern point, with the United States itself across the Bering Strait. These constant frictions, combined with internal disagreements, force Russia, regardless of its political or economic model, to always maintain a large military and intelligence capability, both internal and external, which in turn generates not only a heavy economic cost, but also a historical strengthening of the elite connected to the security forces. Whether in the Tsardom of Moscow, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, or the Russian Federation, its history of friction and distrust with neighbors, and its culture that strengthens the elites connected to these security bodies, make the implementation of a Western-style liberal democracy a very unlikely utopia to ever happen, because in Russia's history, a weak government has always resulted in uprisings and revolts that caused more deaths even than wars or than strong or authoritarian governments. In other words, Russia is a state that fights for its survival all the time. But there is another reason for Russian expansion toward the east, besides just geostrategic defense, which is the geoeconomic factor. The south of Russia, stretching from the border of Ukraine to the north of Mongolia, forms an almost straight line where some of the most fertile lands on the planet are located, with Russia being one of the 4 largest food producers in the world. Meanwhile, in the Caucasus, around the Volga River in Siberia, and in the Far East, there are areas extremely rich in oil, natural gas, and coal. In terms of energy, Russia holds the largest natural gas reserves in the world, the 2nd largest coal reserves, and the 8th largest oil reserves. And finally, around the Ural Mountains in the central, south, and eastern regions are the largest mineral sources on the planet, making it the only country in the world that has all types of minerals within its territory, with Russia's reserves estimated at $75 trillion. Therefore, Russia is simultaneously one of the most vital producers of food, energy, and minerals in the world. Being a fundamental part of the global production chain, without Russia, the entire world supply chain could eventually collapse. This excess wealth, combined with the lack of human labor, has always been viewed by Moscow in an ambiguous way. At times taking pride in its wealth, at other times feeling that foreigners covet and conspire to steal its riches. When it comes to maritime issues, for now, Russia has a series of vulnerabilities, not only on its northern coast, which is mostly impassable for much of the year due to freezing, but also its main ports, Sevastopol in Crimea, Baltitsk in Kaliningrad, Severomorsk in Murmansk, and Vladivostok in the Far East, are locations that could easily be blocked by hostile forces in straits. Thus, although Russia is naturally a land-based actor, the Russian state has always been compelled to develop a navy powerful enough to at least be able to retaliate at a strategic level in case of aggression, and to ensure free access through these straits, or to be able to punish any hostile states that try to block its maritime passages. However, if in the future the speculations about climate changes in the far north of the planet prove to be true, then this would mean a profound and enormous change not only in Russian geopolitics, but also in the global balance of power, since in this case, Russia would become a continuous and permanent naval corridor between Asia and Europe, unlike the routes that pass through the southern part of the planet. Therefore, Russia would be the only country along the entire route, which would greatly reduce transportation costs and would be much faster and more stable than the straits in the southern seas, which are often the target of influence disputes among the major powers. To deal with this, Russian diplomacy has alternated between an ambiguous policy, sometimes flexing its muscles to try to intimidate neighboring countries that attempt to align with foreign powers, and sometimes presenting itself as a friend and protector of countries that feel pressured by other foreign forces. The issue of Russian geopolitics is the best example of why geopolitics, being essentially pragmatic and ultra-realist, must always prevail over ideological aspects, and why a foreign policy motivated by ideological interests is doomed to fail. For example, both Lenin and Stalin were fierce critics of the Russian Empire's foreign policy regarding control over these buffer zones. However, as soon as the Soviet Union was founded, the Soviets' foreign policy ended up, in essence, having the same principles and behaviors as the Russian imperial foreign policy. And in turn, at the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union, the foreign policy of the Russian Federation also had to adopt the same lines and policy guidelines that were used by its predecessors, only changing the way it conducted and planned its geopolitics. Historically, Russia has not only seen itself divided between East and West, but also as a bridge between the European world and the Asian world, prioritizing its relations with Europe since the founding of the Russian Empire in 1721, because Europe is obviously culturally more similar to Muscovite culture, and also because the vast majority of its population lives in its European territory. However, the rise of Asia at the beginning of the 20th century has forced Moscow not only to see its eastern side as a mere defensive area or agricultural producer, but also to consolidate strong interactions with the countries in the region. First, with the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, where Tsarist arrogance in underestimating the Japanese Empire brought the Russian Empire to its knees. The lack of infrastructure weighed heavily on the Russian army, which struggled to be supplied, and its navy, having to practically cross the planet and pass through critical choke points like the south of Suez and Malaga, for example, was unable to impose effective conditions in its confrontation with the Japanese navy. And during World War II, the Soviets only felt comfortable focusing all their war effort against the Germans when they learned that the Japanese were not interested in attacking their eastern flank. Later, with the rise of China, who at first seemed to be an ally, it turned into a huge burden on their defense structure when Chinese interests began to show hostility in border clashes with the Soviets in the Ussuri River region in Manchuria. Moscow, which throughout the entire Cold War had prepared for a war scenario in the European theater, suddenly had to replan its defense doctrine to also protect itself in the far east of Asia, a factor that contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. Today, however, the rise of Asia, far from being a threat, has become part of Russian security, with Asian markets serving as a healthy alternative to counter the dependence on its historic trade relationship with European countries. After all, as the world's geo-economic orbit shifted back to the east, this region gradually became more economically important to the world, and this has also attracted Russia's attention, with Russians increasingly prioritizing their economic, social, and political ties with countries like India, Pakistan, China, Iran, Turkey, the Koreas, and even Japan. Meanwhile, Europe, due to its closer ties with the United States, is steadily reducing its economic relations with Russia and, from Moscow's point of view, poses a greater military threat. Thus, this represents a shift from 300 years of geopolitical focus, where Europe was seen as a priority and Asia as secondary. Now, however, Asia is seen as the priority and Europe as secondary, mainly in terms of military security. However, this change is not something comfortable for the Russians, because a series of challenges accumulate and fall all at once on Moscow, placing enormous burdens on its geopolitical planning capacity. After all, its increasingly aging population is still exposed to Europe. Its eastern part still suffers from a lack of infrastructure and a sufficient human presence. These are problems that will take time to solve because they are big and very complicated. And with the political and economic consequences of the war in Ukraine, Russia has become increasingly dependent on China, which could become a problem if China faces economic, political, or military fluctuations. And to avoid depending too much on the Chinese, the Russians have strengthened their relations with the Indians as a counterbalance, creating a strange, awkward, and complicated triangular relationship in the Central Asian region. However, if there is anything permanent in Russian history, it's the sense of crises and problems. Critical and complicated situations that could lead other countries to collapse are, in Russia, just part of its historical daily life. Over many decades, various analysts have pointed out and prophesied the end of Russia time and time again. However, the Russians, even if stumbling awkwardly and clumsily, continue to stand determined, defying and breaking the prophecies of those who bet on their end. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it. And a mega hyper super special thank you to the channel members, because thanks to them I've been able to bring genuine geopolitics content to you. And if you can't become a member to support the channel and get access to its exclusive content, that's okay. You can still help by subscribing and, most importantly, sharing the video with everyone you know. Thank you all, and see you in the next video. Subtitles by Adriana.